Something's wrong with Scout! The moment the words left Emily's mouth, her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She dropped to her knees beside her golden retriever, who had collapsed on the dirt path, panting heavily. His usual bright eyes were dull, and his golden fur was damp with sweat. Emily's hands trembled as she reached out to stroke his head, his breathing shallow beneath her touch. "Scout, come on, buddy," she urged, her voice shaking. "We just have a little more to go." Beside her, her husband, Jake, pulled out his phone. "We're miles from the trailhead, no signal." He ran a hand through his short blonde hair, glancing down the winding path they had hiked for hours. "We have to carry him." Emily nodded, her pulse racing as she looked down at her best friend. Scout had never struggled on a hike before. He had always been the first to race ahead, tail wagging, leading the way with an energy that never seemed to run out. But now, his legs had given out beneath him, his body limp against the packed earth. Jake bent down and carefully lifted the dog into his arms. Scout was heavy, but there was no other choice. They had to get him back to the car, no matter what it took. Emily grabbed their backpacks, her mind racing through every possibility. Heat exhaustion? A snake bite? Something worse? The trek back felt endless. The midday sun beat down on them, and sweat dripped down Emily's back as she followed Jake's hurried steps. Scout whimpered softly in his arms, his breath coming in short, uneven puffs. Emily fought the lump rising in her throat. She couldn't lose him. At last, the trees thinned, revealing their old truck waiting in the dusty parking lot. Jake placed Scout in the back seat, and Emily climbed in beside him, cradling his head in her lap as Jake threw their bags into the front and started the engine. Come on," Jake muttered as he twisted the key. The truck roared to life, and he threw it into reverse, kicking up dust as they sped down the winding road. Emily pressed her cheek against Scout's head, whispering reassurances even as fear threatened to choke her. The nearest vet clinic was 20 minutes away. Every second stretched unbearably long. Scout's breaths were weak, his eyes barely open. Emily stroked his fur, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. When they pulled up to the clinic, Jake didn't even bother parking properly. He jumped out, ran to the door, and threw it open. "We need help! Our dog collapsed on a hike!" Within seconds, a vet tech and a nurse rushed out with a stretcher. They carefully lifted Scout and whisked him inside, Emily and Jake hurrying after them. The bright clinic lights buzzed overhead, the air cool compared to the scorching heat outside. Emily's heart hammered as she clutched Jake's arm, watching the team wheel Scout into an exam room. The veterinarian, Dr. Mitchell, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stepped in almost immediately. "Tell me everything. What happened?" Emily took a shaky breath. "We were hiking for a few hours. Scout was fine, happy, running like always. Then he slowed down, seemed tired, and suddenly he just collapsed. He's never done that before." Dr. Mitchell nodded, already running his hands over Scout's body, checking his pulse, his gums. "Did he drink enough water? Eat anything unusual?" Jake shook his head. "We brought plenty of water. He drank a little, but not as much as usual." Dr. Mitchell frowned as he looked into Scout's eyes with a small flashlight. "We'll run some tests right away. His vitals are weak. It could be heat stroke, but there may be something more going on." He turned to the vet tech. "Get a full blood panel, IV fluids, and oxygen." Emily and Jake could only watch as the team worked quickly. The nurse inserted an IV into Scout's leg, hanging a bag of fluids on the stand. The vet tech drew blood, rushing it to the back room. Scout lay still on the table, his chest rising and falling too slowly for Emily's comfort. Minutes dragged by. Jake paced the small room while Emily sat beside Scout, holding his paw in both hands. She didn't even realize she was crying until a tear dripped onto her knuckle. She wiped her face and looked up just as Dr. Mitchell returned, holding a clipboard. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes sent a new wave of fear through Emily. "We found something unexpected," he said carefully. "His blood work is unusual." Emily's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" Dr. Mitchell hesitated, glancing between them. "Scout's red blood cell count is off the charts. But that's not all. His white blood cell levels are unlike anything I've ever seen." Jake frowned. "What does that mean? Is it an infection?" The doctor shook his head. "No, it's something else." He took a slow breath before continuing. "I need to run more tests, but based on what we're seeing, it's almost as if his body is adapting to something we don't fully understand yet." Emily exchanged a bewildered look with Jake. "Adapting? To what?" Dr. Mitchell placed a gentle hand on Scout's side. "That's what we need to find out. But I can tell you one thing. It's not something we see in ordinary dogs." Emily sat quietly, her eyes fixed on Scout as he rested on the padded table. The IV fluids and oxygen mask seemed to be helping. His breathing was less labored now. But the look on Dr. Mitchell's face still lingered in her mind, the kind of look that hinted at more questions than answers. Jake leaned against the wall, arms folded, his brow furrowed. "What does that even mean?" he asked, his voice low. "His blood is adapting to something? Adapting how?" Dr. Mitchell, who had stepped out briefly to check on additional test results, returned with a folder in hand. He glanced at Emily and Jake, then back at Scout, who wagged his tail faintly but still looked far from his usual vibrant self. "Let me start by saying we're still working on this," Dr. Mitchell began. "The initial tests show Scout's red blood cells and white blood cells are elevated, more so than I've seen in any dog before. Usually that kind of spike suggests an underlying condition, like an infection or a reaction to something toxic. But his other indicators, his electrolytes, his liver and kidney functions, are stable. It's not typical." Emily's hand tightened on Scout's paw. "So, what are you saying? He's sick, but not in the usual way?" "Not exactly," Dr. Mitchell said, choosing his words carefully. "What's puzzling is the nature of the changes. It's almost as though his body is compensating for something that's not there." Jake's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, not there?" "The changes we're seeing, like his elevated white blood cells, usually occur when the body is fighting off a major infection or healing from an injury. But Scout doesn't show any signs of an active infection, no inflammation or fever. It's as if his body is preparing for something, rather than responding to it." Emily shook her head. "I don't understand. If he's not sick, then what's causing it? Could it have been something on the trail, a plant or something he ate?" "We considered that," Dr. Mitchell said. "But there's no evidence he ingested anything harmful. His gastrointestinal tract looks normal, and his blood work doesn't show any toxins. That's why I'm recommending further tests, genetic tests specifically." "Genetic tests?" Jake asked, puzzled. "Why would that be necessary?" Dr. Mitchell hesitated, then pulled up a stool. "Scout's blood work shows a pattern I've only seen in certain rare cases involving genetic conditions or unique physiological traits. There are instances where some dogs have rare mutations that cause their bodies to produce unusual levels of certain cells or adapt in ways we don't fully understand. It's rare, but it does happen." Emily glanced at Scout, who lifted his head weakly at the sound of her voice. "You think Scout might have one of these conditions?" "I don't know yet," Dr. Mitchell admitted. That's why we need the genetic tests. They'll give us more insight into what might be going on. Until then, we're focusing on stabilizing him. I'd like to keep him here overnight for observation, if that's okay with you. Jake looked at Emily, who nodded without hesitation. Of course. Whatever he needs. Dr. Mitchell smiled softly. Good. We'll take excellent care of him. I'll let you know as soon as we have more information. With that, the vet techs moved Scout into a recovery area. Emily and Jake stood at the window, watching as he was settled into a comfortable kennel with padded blankets and a gentle stream of oxygen. He looked small and fragile compared to his usual robust self, and Emily had to swallow back another wave of tears. Do you think he'll be okay? She asked Jake softly. Jake put an arm around her shoulders. He's a tough dog, Em. If anyone can bounce back, it's Scout. Let's give the doctor some time to figure this out. They left the clinic reluctantly, with instructions to check back in the morning. That night, the house felt emptier without Scout. Emily found herself glancing at his usual spots, the corner of the living room where he napped, the spot by the door where he greeted them with an excited wag whenever they came home. It was strange how quiet it felt without him padding around, his tail thumping against the furniture. As she lay in bed, her mind raced with possibilities. Could it really be something genetic? She thought about Scout's parents, whom they'd met briefly when he was just a puppy. They were both healthy, lively golden retrievers, nothing unusual about them. She wondered if they should have asked more questions, done more research. But at the time, Scout had been just a happy, fluffy ball of energy. They never imagined he might have something unique in his biology. The next morning, Emily and Jake returned to the clinic bright and early. Dr. Mitchell greeted them with a smile, but his expression was still serious. Scout had a stable night. His vitals are improving, and he seems a bit more alert today. Emily felt a surge of relief. That's great news. Does that mean you've figured out what's going on? We're getting closer, Dr. Mitchell said. I sent the genetic samples off for analysis, but that can take a few days. In the meantime, I'd like to start him on a specialized diet and continue monitoring his blood levels. This will help us determine if the changes we're seeing are stable or if they're progressing. Jake nodded. Whatever you think is best. We just want him to get better. Scout greeted them with a wag of his tail when they were allowed to visit him. He still seemed tired, but his eyes were brighter, and he leaned into Emily's touch as she scratched behind his ears. Hey, buddy, she murmured. You're gonna be okay, aren't you? He gave a soft woof, as if to reassure her. The next few days were a roller coaster of emotions. Scout stayed at the clinic while the genetic tests were processed, and Emily and Jake visited every day. He slowly regained some strength, wagging his tail more vigorously and even standing up to greet them. Dr. Mitchell continued to adjust his treatment plan, always keeping them informed. Finally, the day came when Dr. Mitchell called them into his office. Emily's stomach fluttered as they sat down, holding hands. The veterinarian opened the folder on his desk and looked at them with a steady gaze. We have the results, he said, and it's as I suspected. Scout has a very rare genetic mutation. It's not harmful, but it's unusual. Essentially, his body produces more red and white blood cells than a typical dog's. Normally, this wouldn't cause any problems, but combined with the stress of the hike, it caused his system to become overwhelmed. Emily blinked. So he's not sick? No, not in the conventional sense, Dr. Mitchell clarified. This condition is something he was born with. It's part of who he is. The good news is that now we know what's happening, we can manage it. He'll need a specialized diet, regular checkups, and we'll have to monitor his activity levels. But he can live a happy, healthy life. Relief washed over Emily like a wave. She looked at Jake, who gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. That's wonderful news. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. The vet smiled. Scout's a remarkable dog, and with a little extra care, he'll be back to his old self in no time. When they brought Scout home that afternoon, he seemed to know he was on the mend. He padded around the house, sniffing every corner as if he were rediscovering his territory. His wagging tail and the familiar sparkle in his eyes lifted Emily's spirits in a way she couldn't describe. As the weeks went by, Scout grew stronger. Emily and Jake adjusted to his new routine, learning to balance his activity with his condition. He might not be able to tackle the longest hikes anymore, but that didn't matter. Every moment with him was precious, and they knew how lucky they were to have him. Scout's unique condition became a part of their family story, a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, love, patience, and understanding could lead to hope and happiness. And every time Scout bounded toward them, tail wagging, Emily couldn't help but feel grateful for the dog, who had stolen her heart and taught her what it truly meant to care for someone, no matter what challenges came their way. Scout's progress over the next several weeks amazed everyone. The once dramatic collapse on the hiking trail now felt like a distant memory, replaced by days full of small victories. Each morning, Scout greeted Emily and Jake with an eager wag of his tail, a sign that his energy and spirit were steadily returning. Under Dr. Mitchell's guidance, Scout was put on a specialized high-protein diet designed to keep his unusual blood composition stable. Emily diligently measured out his meals, making sure every bite met the vet's precise instructions. Jake took on the role of physical therapist, leading Scout through gentle exercises in the backyard. Each session felt like a milestone. At first, it was simply a slow walk from one end of the yard to the other. Then it became 2 laps, then 3, until one day Scout managed a full circuit without any hesitation. Emily and Jake adjusted to their new normal quickly. Their afternoons, once spent on long hikes, were now focused on shorter, more controlled adventures. Scout didn't seem to mind. He wagged his tail at the sight of his leash, excited for even the briefest outing. For Emily, these moments held a bittersweet joy. She missed their longer treks, but felt grateful for every step Scout could take. The sight of him trotting along, his fur catching the sunlight, filled her heart with hope. One cool Saturday morning, Jake suggested a trip to a nearby nature preserve. The trails were less rugged, more suitable for Scout's current condition. Emily hesitated at first, concerned about pushing him too far too soon. But Jake's optimism was infectious. "It's a flat trail," he said. "We'll take it slow. Bring plenty of water. Scout will love it." They packed a small backpack with snacks for themselves, an extra water bottle for Scout, and a lightweight blanket in case they needed to rest. As they arrived at the preserve, Scout perked up, his nose twitching at the scents carried on the gentle breeze. Emily crouched down to fasten his leash, giving him a reassuring scratch behind the ears. "Ready, boy?" she asked softly. Scout wagged his tail in response, his golden coat gleaming in the morning sun. The trail stretched out before them, shaded by a canopy of oak and maple trees. Birds chirped overhead, and the sound of a distant creek provided a calming backdrop. Scout walked between Emily and Jake, his head held high, his steps steady. They moved at a leisurely pace, stopping often to let Scout rest and drink water. Each time they paused, Scout seemed to take in his surroundings with an almost thoughtful gaze, as if savoring every moment. Emily and Jake chatted quietly as they walked, their voices blending with the natural symphony around them. They reflected on how far Scout had come since that terrifying day on the trail. For Emily, it was more than just a physical recovery. It felt like a return to normalcy, a reassurance that they could navigate challenges together. Jake, ever the optimist, talked about future hikes and camping trips. Emily smiled, not quite ready to commit to such plans, but comforted by his confidence. Halfway through the trail, they reached a small clearing where sunlight spilled onto a patch of soft grass. It seemed like the perfect spot to rest. Emily spread out the blanket, and Scout immediately lay down, his head resting on his paws. Emily and Jake sat beside him, sharing a quiet moment of peace. Emily couldn't help but reach over to stroke Scout's back, her fingers brushing against his thick, golden fur. His eyes closed briefly, his breathing calm and steady. "Look at him," Jake said quietly. "He's doing so much better." Emily nodded. "I didn't think we'd get here so soon. But he's a fighter." Jake smiled, leaning back on his elbows. "He's more than that. He's unique." They lingered in the clearing a while longer, letting Scout rest before continuing on. The remainder of the trail passed smoothly, and by the time they returned to the car, Scout seemed content, his tail wagging lightly, as Emily helped him into the back seat. That evening, as Scout lay curled up in his favorite spot by the fireplace, Emily sat on the couch with Jake, a warm mug of tea in her hands. The glow from the fire cast a comforting light over the room. Scout's peaceful expression, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm, brought a wave of gratitude over her. "He's really okay now, isn't he?" she said softly. Jake nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Yeah, he's more than okay. He's stronger than ever." Emily smiled, leaning into him. For the first time since that day on the trail, she felt a sense of calm. Scout was not just recovering. He was thriving. And for her, that was more than enough. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a comforting routine. Scout's strength continued to build, and his energy levels seemed more consistent. Emily and Jake maintained their shorter outings, gradually increasing the distance as Scout's stamina improved. The joy of seeing him run, play, and explore again was something Emily never took for granted. At each follow-up visit, Dr. Mitchell expressed amazement at Scout's progress. The genetic mutation, while still a mystery in many ways, didn't seem to be causing any additional complications. In fact, Scout's body seemed to have adapted remarkably well. The careful balance of diet, exercise, and routine checkups had made all the difference. One day, as Emily was brushing Scout's fur on the back porch, she noticed the way his coat shimmered in the sunlight. He looked so vibrant, so full of life. She paused, letting the brush rest against her knee, and just watched him. His eyes met hers, and he wagged his tail, that familiar glimmer of joy and trust lighting up his expression. Emily felt a lump form in her throat, not from sadness, but from a deep sense of gratitude. "You're a special boy, you know that?" she said softly. Scout gave a small bark in response, as if to agree. For Emily, Jake, and Scout, the journey wasn't just about recovery, it was about rediscovery. Each day brought a new reason to smile, a reminder of the resilience and strength that had carried them through. Scout's unique condition, once a source of worry, now felt like a part of what made him who he was. And for that, they wouldn't change a thing. Scout's health remained steady over the following months, and as his strength grew, Emily and Jake started considering small ways to reintroduce some of their favorite activities. Their hikes became more frequent, although they were still shorter and more carefully planned than before. Scout's tail wagged with anticipation each time he saw his leash, and his enthusiasm for the outdoors seemed to shine brighter with every trip. One particular weekend, Emily suggested visiting a park they hadn't been to in years. It was a quiet, lesser-known spot, with gently winding trails that offered beautiful views of rolling meadows and a sparkling creek. Jake agreed, eager to explore somewhere new with Scout. They set out early in the morning, the cool air carrying the scent of wildflowers. Scout trotted alongside them, his ears perked up and his nose constantly twitching as he took in the rich tapestry of scents. The path was wide and well-maintained, allowing them to walk side by side as they chatted and took in the scenery. About halfway through the trail, they reached a wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The sound of the water bubbling over smooth stones created a soothing melody, and the sunlight filtering through the trees cast playful patterns on the ground. Scout stopped at the edge of the bridge, his head tilted as he watched the water below. Emily smiled and crouched beside him. "What do you think, Scout?" she asked. "Isn't it beautiful?" Scout gave a happy bark, his tail wagging energetically. Jake leaned against the bridge's railing, looking down at the creek. "It's been a long time since we've been here," he said. "I forgot how peaceful it is." Emily nodded. "It's nice to come back, though. And it feels good to see Scout enjoying it, too." They spent a while at the bridge, letting Scout rest and drink some water. Emily and Jake shared a few snacks, the quiet serenity of the moment making them feel more connected than ever. Scout eventually lay down near their feet, his eyes half closed, as if he were soaking up the tranquility. When they finally continued on, the trail meandered through a patch of tall grass and wildflowers. Scout bounded ahead a few steps, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. He turned back every so often, as if to make sure Emily and Jake were still following. The sight made Emily laugh softly. "He's so full of energy today," she said. Jake smiled. "Yeah, it's good to see. I think this place agrees with him." As the day went on, they found themselves completely immersed in the experience. The worries and stresses of everyday life faded into the background, replaced by the simple joy of being outdoors with their beloved dog. Scout's unique condition, which had once seemed so daunting, was no longer the focus. Instead, it felt like just another part of his story, something that made him special, but not something that defined him. When they reached the end of the trail, they stopped at a small picnic area overlooking the creek. The view was breathtaking, the water sparkling in the afternoon sun and the hills rolling gently in the distance. Emily spread out a blanket, and they all settled in for a relaxing break. Scout lay down beside them, his head resting on Emily's knee as she stroked his fur. "I love moments like this," she said softly. "Just us and Scout, enjoying the simple things." Jake nodded. "Me too. It's like everything's right in the world, at least for a little while." They stayed there until the sun began to dip lower in the sky. When it was time to head back, Scout trotted alongside them, looking content and happy. The drive home was peaceful, the kind of comfortable silence that comes from a day well spent. Later that night, as Emily prepared dinner, Jake sat on the couch, scrolling through old photos on his phone. "Hey, look at this," he said, holding up his screen. Emily walked over, drying her hands on a dish towel. The photo was from a couple of years ago, taken on a particularly challenging hike they had done in the mountains. Scout was in the foreground, standing proudly on a rocky outcrop with the sprawling valley behind him. His tongue was out, his expression one of pure joy. "I remember that day," Emily said, smiling. "He was unstoppable," Jake chuckled. "It's funny. Back then we never gave a second thought to how much he could handle. He was just so strong and full of energy." Emily nodded, her smile fading slightly. And now we have to think about everything. We plan every hike, every meal. It's different, but I wouldn't trade it. He's still our scout, and that's what matters. Jake reached over and squeezed her hand. You're right. It's not about how far we go. It's about doing it together. Emily returned to the kitchen, feeling a renewed sense of gratitude. Scout was lounging by the fireplace, his head resting on his paws, looking as content as ever. She couldn't imagine life without him, and she didn't need to. Each day was a gift, and she intended to make the most of every moment with their beloved dog. Scout's world began to open up once more. Each day brought new chances to explore, to run, to feel the sun on his back. Emily and Jake found themselves talking about possibilities they hadn't dared consider just a few months earlier. Scout's unusual blood condition no longer defined him. It was simply another part of the extraordinary dog they loved. One crisp morning, Emily and Jake decided to revisit a hiking trail they hadn't been on since Scout's collapse. This trail had been a favorite of theirs, dotted with wildflowers and offering stunning views of the surrounding hills, but it had taken on a bittersweet aura after that fateful day. Still, Scout's improvements gave them the confidence to try again, and as they drove to the trailhead, they couldn't help but feel a mix of nervousness and excitement. When they arrived, Scout bounded out of the car, his golden coat shining in the sunlight. He gave a single, happy bark, his tail wagging like a banner. Emily knelt to adjust his leash and looked into his bright eyes. "You ready, boy?" she asked, her voice a little softer than usual. Scout licked her hand in response, his enthusiasm undiminished. The trail stretched out before them, winding gently through tall grass and clusters of evergreens. The morning air was crisp and clean, the kind of weather that invited long walks and deep breaths. They set off at a leisurely pace, letting Scout lead the way, but keeping an eye on his energy levels. The trail was familiar, but carried a different energy this time. An unspoken promise that things could be better. Scout walked confidently, his steps steady and measured. Every so often he'd stop to sniff a patch of grass or inspect a fallen branch, his curiosity as sharp as ever. Emily and Jake kept the conversation light, their laughter blending with the rustling leaves and the distant chatter of birds. They both knew to remain watchful, but it was impossible not to enjoy the moment. As the trail began a gentle incline, Emily and Jake paused to give Scout a break. They found a flat rock to sit on, and Emily pulled out a water bowl for Scout. He drank eagerly, his tail wagging as he looked up at them, seeming to ask, "What's next?" "We're not going to push it too far," Emily said, as much to herself as to Jake. "We'll turn around before he gets tired." Jake nodded, though his gaze lingered on the trail ahead. "He's doing great, though. He's got that spark back." Emily smiled at that. It was true. Scout's spirit, his unstoppable curiosity, had never really left. It had just been buried under the weight of uncertainty. Now, it was shining through again, and it was a joy to see. When they resumed their hike, they kept the pace slow and steady. The path leveled out again, and soon they found themselves walking along a ridge with breathtaking views of the valley below. Emily felt a pang of nostalgia as she remembered their old hikes. This was where they had first discovered Scout's love of heights, how he would stop at the edge of an overlook and gaze out at the horizon as if he were taking it all in. Scout paused now, his nose lifted to catch the breeze. His tail wagged gently, his posture relaxed but alert. Emily crouched beside him, resting a hand on his back. "You remember this spot, don't you?" she said softly. Scout leaned into her touch, his ears flicking back and forth. Jake joined them, and together they stood there, a quiet moment of shared memory. For Emily, it felt like reclaiming something precious, something that had been lost but was now within reach again. The rest of the hike unfolded smoothly. Scout's pace never faltered, and by the time they reached a shaded clearing at the end of the trail, Emily felt a profound sense of gratitude. They sat down on a fallen log, letting Scout rest in the cool grass. He lay there contentedly, his tongue lolling out, looking as happy as they'd ever seen him. "I'm so proud of him," Emily said quietly, stroking his head. "He's come so far." Jake smiled. "He's a good boy, always has been." The drive home was peaceful, Scout snoozing in the back seat. Emily and Jake exchanged occasional glances, a silent understanding passing between them. They had made it through something difficult, something that had once felt insurmountable, and now here they were, stronger and more connected than ever. As the weeks turned into months, Scout's life continued to improve. His daily walks grew longer, his energy returned to levels they hadn't seen in years. Emily and Jake still took precautions, monitoring his diet, keeping his checkups regular, but their days felt normal again, even joyful. Scout's recovery wasn't just a return to his old self. It was a new beginning. Each outing felt like a celebration, a reminder of how much they had to be thankful for. And Scout, ever the loyal companion, seemed to sense their gratitude. He met each day with a wagging tail, a happy bark, and a love that filled their home with light. Through it all, Emily often thought back to that day on the trail, the fear and uncertainty that had gripped her. It had been a turning point, not just for Scout, but for all of them. It had shown her the depths of her love for him, the lengths she was willing to go to ensure his happiness and health. Scout was more than just a pet. He was family. And as she watched him explore the backyard, sniffing at flowers and chasing butterflies, Emily knew that their journey was far from over. They still had so many trails to walk, so many memories to make. In the quiet moments, when Scout lay at her feet, his head resting on her lap, Emily would run her fingers through his fur and whisper, "You're one special dog, you know that." And every time, Scout would look up at her with those bright, trusting eyes, as if to say, "I know." Scout's life settled into a comfortable rhythm, the days passing with a sense of quiet contentment. His morning walks with Emily and Jake were a cherished routine, a time for all three of them to reconnect and enjoy the simple pleasures of being outside. The neighborhood was full of interesting scents and friendly faces, and Scout greeted each new day with the enthusiasm that had always defined him. On weekends, they ventured further afield. Short drives to local parks turned into small adventures. Scout's excitement began the moment they grabbed his leash, his tail wagging so hard that it seemed to shake his entire body. He would bounce around the living room while Emily packed their supplies. Water bottles, a collapsible bowl for Scout, a few snacks, and a blanket to sit on if they found a sunny spot. One Sunday morning, Emily suggested visiting a new trail she'd read about online. It was in a nature preserve a little over an hour away, known for its gently sloping paths and beautiful forest views. Jake agreed immediately, eager to explore somewhere new. Scout, of course, didn't need convincing. He hopped into the back seat of the car with his usual excitement, ready for whatever adventure lay ahead. The drive was scenic, winding through countryside dotted with barns, fields of wild flowers, and the occasional small town. Scout seemed to enjoy the ride as much as the destination, his nose pressed against the window, taking in all the new sights and smells. When they arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty, and the air was crisp and cool. A perfect day for a hike. Emily clipped Scout's leash onto his harness, and they set off down the trail. The path was just as beautiful as she had hoped, lined with tall pines and dappled sunlight. The sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves filled the air. Scout walked between them, occasionally pulling ahead to investigate an interesting scent, or pausing to sniff at a cluster of flowers. Emily couldn't help but smile as she watched him. His energy was strong, his steps confident. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago they had been so worried about him. The trail meandered through the forest, leading them past a bubbling creek and several small wooden bridges. Emily and Jake walked at a leisurely pace, letting Scout take the lead. They stopped frequently, both to let Scout rest and to simply enjoy the beauty of their surroundings. Jake took a few pictures with his phone, capturing Scout's golden fur against the lush green backdrop of the forest. "He looks like he belongs here," Jake said, showing Emily the screen. She nodded, her heart full at the sight of their happy, healthy dog. As they continued, the trail climbed gently, eventually opening up onto a ridge with a stunning view of the valley below. They paused there, letting Scout sit between them while they admired the scenery. Emily pulled out a water bottle and Scout's bowl, pouring him a drink. He lapped it up eagerly, his tail wagging as if to say, "This is the best day ever." They spent a while on the ridge, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment. Emily leaned back against Jake, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. "I'm so glad we came here," she said softly. Jake smiled, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Me too. This is perfect." Scout, as if sensing their contentment, let out a happy bark and nuzzled Emily's hand. She laughed, scratching behind his ears. "You're having a good time too, aren't you, Scout?" The return trip was just as enjoyable. Scout's energy stayed steady, and he seemed content to keep walking, his ears perked up and his nose constantly exploring. By the time they reached the car, he was happily tired but still wagging his tail. As they drove home, Scout curled up on the back seat, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep. Emily glanced back at him, her heart full of love for the dog who had brought so much joy into their lives. Over the next several weeks, Emily and Jake continued to explore new trails, gradually increasing the length of their walks. Scout's strength grew with each outing, and he seemed to thrive on the variety and adventure. They made a point of visiting different parks, each with its own unique charm. Some had open meadows where Scout could sniff at the tall grass, while others offered shaded forest paths that felt like stepping into another world. As Scout's stamina improved, so did Emily's confidence. She no longer felt the constant worry that had weighed on her in the months following his collapse. Instead, she found herself enjoying the moment, appreciating the simple pleasure of walking alongside her dog and her husband. It wasn't just about Scout's recovery. It was about rediscovering the joy they had always found in the outdoors. One weekend, they planned a day trip to a state park known for its beautiful lake and gentle shoreline trail. They packed a picnic, complete with a special treat for Scout, a slice of grilled chicken that Emily knew he would love. The drive took a couple of hours, but the anticipation made it fly by. Scout seemed to sense the excitement, his tail wagging almost non-stop as they pulled into the parking area. The trail began at a sandy beach and followed the curve of the lake, offering stunning views of the water. Emily and Jake found a shaded spot near the shore to lay out their blanket and enjoy their picnic. Scout lay beside them, happily chewing on his chicken treat. The sun sparkled on the water, and the gentle lapping of the waves created a soothing soundtrack. After lunch, they walked along the shore, Scout splashing his paws in the shallow water. Emily and Jake laughed as he tried to chase a few small fish that darted by, The simple joy of watching Scout play was more rewarding than they could have imagined. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, they made their way back to the car. Scout's golden coat was damp, and he smelled faintly of lake water, but his happy expression made it all worthwhile. Emily smiled as she watched him hop into the back seat, his tongue lolling out in a doggy grin. On the drive home, Emily and Jake talked about the places they wanted to explore next. Scout lay stretched out on the seat, his tail occasionally thumping against the door as he dozed. It was moments like this that made all the effort and care worthwhile. Emily felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Scout's recovery, but for the bond they shared and the memories they were creating together. Each day brought a new adventure, a new reason to smile. Scout's resilience had taught Emily and Jake the value of persistence and hope. No matter how challenging the journey had been, they knew they were stronger for having faced it together. And as long as Scout was by their side, there was no trail too steep, no path too long, and no challenge they couldn't overcome. Scout's newfound vigor carried him through the changing seasons, each day bringing another small triumph. With every step, Emily and Jake's confidence in his recovery grew stronger. The once fragile sense of hope now felt deeply rooted, as steady as the trails they walked together. Scout had become their symbol of resilience, his golden coat shining as brightly as their spirits. One chilly morning in early autumn, Emily proposed a new challenge, a trail that led to a secluded waterfall tucked away in a nearby forest reserve. They had heard about it from friends, a place known for its breathtaking views and tranquil atmosphere. While it was a bit longer than their usual hikes, Emily believed Scout was ready. Jake agreed, though he made sure to pack extra water and a few snacks, just in case. The drive to the reserve was peaceful, the road winding through countryside dotted with pumpkin patches and trees, whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Scout sat in the back seat, his ears perked up as if he sensed the day's adventure would be something special. Emily glanced at him in the rearview mirror, smiling at the sight of his wagging tail. When they arrived at the trailhead, a crisp breeze greeted them. Scout hopped out of the car, his nose immediately to the ground as he investigated the new scents. Emily knelt to adjust his harness and gave him a reassuring pat. "This is going to be fun, buddy," she said. Scout looked up at her, his bright eyes full of trust and excitement. The trail started out gently, winding through tall oaks and maples. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the earthy scent of the forest filled the air. Scout trotted ahead, his steps confident but not rushed. Emily and Jake followed at a comfortable pace, exchanging quiet conversation and pointing out the occasional squirrel or bird that darted through the trees. As the trail progressed, the terrain became slightly more challenging. A shallow stream crossed their path, its clear water sparkling in the sunlight. Scout hesitated for a moment before stepping in, his paws splashing as he tested the water's depth. He looked back at Emily, his tail wagging as if to say, "This is fun!" They continued on, the sound of the stream fading as the trail climbed higher. The path narrowed and twisted, with roots and rocks jutting out to form natural steps. Scout navigated them with ease, his movements as graceful as they were purposeful. Emily felt a swell of pride as she watched him, marveling at how far he had come. After about an hour of steady hiking, they heard the faint sound of rushing water. It grew louder with each step, until they rounded a bend and saw the waterfall in the distance. The cascade spilled over a rocky ledge, its mist catching the sunlight and creating a faint rainbow. The sight was stunning, and for a moment, all three of them stood in silence, taking it in. Scout wagged his tail and let out a soft bark, as if to share his approval. Emily laughed, giving him a scratch behind the ears. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said. Jake nodded, pulling out his phone to snap a few pictures. They found a flat rock near the water's edge and settled down for a break. Emily unpacked some water and a few treats for Scout, who eagerly accepted them. As he chewed, his tail thumped against the ground in a steady rhythm. The waterfall's roar filled the air, but it was a soothing sound, rather than an overwhelming one. Emily leaned back against Jake, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Moments like this, surrounded by nature and their loyal dog, were what made all the challenges worth it. Scout's journey had taught them to appreciate these simple pleasures, to find joy in the present. After their break, they explored the area around the waterfall. Scout splashed in the shallow pools, his playful energy reminding them of his younger days. Emily took out her phone and captured a short video of him bounding through the water, his golden coat glistening in the sunlight. "He looks like he's having the time of his life," she said. "He is," Jake agreed. "And so am I." Eventually, they began the hike back, taking their time to enjoy the trail from a new perspective. The climb down was easier, and the late afternoon light cast a warm glow through the trees. Scout seemed as energized as ever, his tail wagging constantly and his steps steady. When they reached the car, he hopped into the back seat and settled down, his tongue lolling out as he panted happily. The drive home was filled with quiet satisfaction. Emily glanced back at Scout, who was lying comfortably, his eyes half closed. "He did amazing," she said. Jake nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "He's unstoppable." As autumn deepened, they continued to seek out new trails, each one a little more challenging than the last. Scout rose to every occasion, his strength and stamina growing with each outing. Emily and Jake marveled at his progress, finding inspiration in his resilience. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, built on trust, love, and a shared appreciation for life's simple joys. One particularly memorable hike took them to a ridge overlooking a sprawling valley. The trail was steep in places, with switchbacks that tested their endurance, but the view at the top was worth every step. They stood together, Scout's golden fur catching the sunlight, the valley stretching out before them like a vast, living painting. The moment felt timeless, a reminder of the beauty that could be found in both the journey and the destination. Scout, as always, seemed to understand. He sat between them, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his tail wagging gently. Emily knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around his neck. "You're amazing," she whispered. Scout gave her a quick lick on the cheek, his way of saying, "So are you." As they descended the ridge, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Scout's recovery had been a journey not just of physical healing, but of emotional growth and renewed perspective. Every step they took together reinforced her belief that they could handle whatever challenges lay ahead. Scout's unique condition, once a source of worry, had become a source of strength, a reminder that resilience was its own kind of magic. The seasons continued to change, each one bringing new adventures. Winter brought snow-covered trails that Scout bounded through with unbridled joy. Spring offered lush greenery and blooming flowers, a canvas of color that Scout explored with endless curiosity. Summer's long days meant even more time outdoors, with Scout's energy seemingly boundless. Through it all, Emily and Jake cherished every moment. Scout's presence had a way of grounding them, reminding them of what truly mattered. His journey from that harrowing day on the trail to his vibrant, thriving self was a testament to the power of love, care, and persistence. And as they walked side by side, the trail stretching out before them, Emily knew that the best adventures were still to come. Scout would lead the way, his golden coat shining like a beacon, his tail wagging with unshakable joy. Scout continued to thrive as the months rolled on. His morning and evening walks had become the foundation of their daily routine, but Emily and Jake always looked forward to the weekends. Those were the days when they ventured further, discovering new parks, trails, and quiet country lanes where Scout could lead the way. Each trip brought its own small adventures, moments that reminded Emily and Jake of why they had fallen in love with the outdoors in the first place. One Saturday in late autumn, Jake suggested a trail he had read about online. It was known for its wide-open spaces and gentle hills, perfect for a dog that loved to run and explore. Scout's condition had remained stable for so long that they no longer worried about overexertion, though they still carried plenty of water and made sure to pace themselves. The trail's entrance was tucked away behind a row of tall, weathered pines, and the parking lot was almost empty when they arrived. Scout leapt out of the car, tail wagging furiously, his excitement impossible to contain. Emily smiled as she secured his harness. "I think he knows we're in for a fun day." Jake chuckled. "He's always ready. I don't think I've ever seen him not excited about a hike." They set off at a leisurely pace, the trail opening up to a field that stretched out under a bright blue sky. Scout trotted ahead, pausing occasionally to sniff at patches of grass or investigate a rustling bush. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. Emily pulled her jacket closer around her, feeling a deep sense of contentment as she watched Scout explore. His enthusiasm was infectious, making her feel as though they were embarking on an adventure every time they set foot outside. About an hour into their walk, the trail led them to a small pond surrounded by reeds. The water's surface reflected the cloudless sky, creating a picture-perfect scene. They decided to stop here for a break, sitting on a large flat rock by the edge of the pond. Emily poured water into Scout's collapsible bowl, and he lapped it up eagerly, his tail wagging in rhythm with each gulp. "Look at that view," Jake said, gesturing across the water. "This is exactly what I needed today." Emily nodded, leaning against him. "It's beautiful, and Scout's loving it too. Just look at him." Scout had finished his water and was now sniffing the reeds at the edge of the pond. A dragonfly buzzed nearby, catching his attention, and he watched it intently, his head tilting slightly as it darted back and forth. Emily pulled out her phone and snapped a quick photo. "I can't get enough of these moments. He's so happy." They stayed by the pond for a while, enjoying the stillness and the soft sounds of nature. When they eventually got back on the trail, Scout seemed even more energized, his steps light and confident. The path took them through a shaded section of woods, where the trees formed a canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the ground. The air was cooler here, and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot added a comforting rhythm to their walk. As they rounded a bend, Emily spotted a cluster of wildflowers still in bloom. She knelt to take a closer look, marveling at the vibrant colors. "I didn't expect to see these so late in the season," she said, beckoning Jake over. Jake crouched beside her, inspecting the delicate petals. "They're incredible. I love finding these little surprises out here. Scout joined them, sniffing at the flowers before looking up at Emily, as if waiting for the next adventure. She laughed and scratched his ears. Okay, we'll keep moving. You're such a good guide, Scout. The rest of the hike unfolded as seamlessly as the first half. The trail eventually looped back toward the parking lot, and by the time they returned to the car, Scout was visibly happy, but not overly tired. Emily helped him into the back seat, where he promptly lay down, his tail wagging a few more times before he closed his eyes. The drive home was quiet and peaceful. Emily gazed out the window, the countryside rolling past as she thought about how much Scout had changed their lives. His presence had transformed their days into something more meaningful, more connected. Each walk, each trail, was another chapter in a story that brought them closer together. As they pulled into the driveway, Emily turned to Jake. I think that was one of my favorite hikes yet. Jake smiled. Mine too. Let's plan another one soon. Inside, Scout settled into his usual spot by the fireplace. Emily watched as he stretched out, his golden fur catching the warm glow of the flames. She felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the wonderful day they'd had, but for all the moments Scout had given them. His resilience, his joy for life, reminded her to cherish every step, every trail, every moment. In the weeks that followed, their adventures continued. With each hike, Scout grew stronger, more confident, more curious. Emily and Jake made a point of seeking out new places, their weekends filled with exploration and discovery. Scout's tail never seemed to stop wagging, a constant reminder of how far he had come and how much he loved the life they were building together. One memorable outing took them to a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of rolling hills. The climb was steady, but not too difficult, and the view from the top took their breath away. Emily knelt beside Scout, wrapping her arm around him as they gazed out at the horizon. This, she said softly, this is why we keep going. This is what it's all about. Scout gave her a quick lick on the cheek, as if agreeing. Jake snapped a few photos, capturing the moment for posterity. They stayed on the ridge for a long time, soaking in the beauty and the sense of accomplishment. When they finally headed back down, Scout led the way, his steps sure and steady. The seasons changed again, and with winter came a new set of adventures. Scout loved the snow, bounding through the drifts with unbridled enthusiasm. Emily and Jake dressed warmly for their outings, laughing as Scout kicked up sprays of powder and tried to catch falling snowflakes. It was as if he had been waiting all year for this, his playful energy a testament to how far he had come. Even on the coldest days, Scout's spirit never waned. Emily marveled at his resilience, his ability to find joy in every moment. They walked through quiet woods, their breath visible in the frosty air, and Scout's golden coat stood out brilliantly against the white landscape. The sound of his paws crunching through the snow became as familiar and comforting as the crackling of the fireplace at home. As winter gave way to spring, Emily and Jake began planning longer hikes again. The world was waking up, the trails bursting with new life. Flowers bloomed, streams swelled with melting snow, and the air was filled with birdsong. Scout seemed to thrive in this season of renewal, his steps light and eager. Emily often found herself watching him, wondering if he truly understood how much he meant to them. They discovered a trail that led to a hidden meadow, a place so peaceful it felt like stepping into a dream. The grass was soft and green, dotted with wildflowers, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms. Scout ran ahead, his tail wagging furiously as he explored every corner. Emily and Jake followed, their hearts full at the sight of their happy, healthy dog. After a while, they spread out a blanket and sat in the shade of a large oak tree. Scout lay down beside them, his head resting on Emily's lap. She stroked his fur, her thoughts drifting back to the beginning of his journey. The fear, the uncertainty, they seemed so distant now, almost like they had happened to someone else. All that mattered was this moment, this sense of peace and togetherness. Jake reached over and took her hand. "I can't imagine life without him," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "Me neither. He's a gift. Every day with him is a gift." As they sat there, the meadow stretching out around them, Emily felt a deep sense of gratitude. Scout's journey had been one of challenges and triumphs, of fear and hope. It had brought them closer, taught them to savor each moment, and shown them the power of love and resilience. They weren't at the end of that journey, not by a long shot. The trail still stretched out before them, and they would walk it together, one step at a time. Scout's adventures continued to expand, each new trail and park adding another layer to the tapestry of their lives. Emily and Jake loved watching Scout's joy unfold with every outing, his boundless energy a reminder of just how far he had come. As the days grew longer, they planned more ambitious trips, carefully considering how much Scout could handle. Each time, Scout surprised them with his eagerness, his strength, and his unflagging spirit. One morning, Jake mentioned a trail he'd discovered while scrolling through a local hiking blog. It wound through a lush forest and ended at a wide, sparkling lake. Emily agreed instantly. They hadn't been to a large body of water since the trip to the state park, and the thought of seeing Scout splash in the shallows again filled her with excitement. They packed their usual supplies, water, snacks, Scout's collapsible bowl, and set out under a sky streaked with the soft pinks and oranges of dawn. The trailhead was tucked behind a small roadside cafe, its entrance marked by a wooden sign etched with the trail's name. The path started with a gentle incline, weaving between towering pines that created a natural cathedral. Morning light filtered through the branches, casting golden patches on the forest floor. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Scout's tail wagged furiously as he darted from side to side, sniffing everything in sight. The first half-mile passed easily. The trail was well maintained, the ground soft with fallen needles. Emily and Jake walked side by side, talking quietly and laughing at Scout's antics. They paused often to let Scout investigate the surroundings, snapping pictures of him whenever he struck a particularly endearing pose. His enthusiasm was contagious, filling the forest with a sense of warmth despite the cool air. As they ventured further, the trail began to climb. It wasn't a steep incline, but it was steady, and Emily was glad they'd brought plenty of water. Scout handled the ascent with ease, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. Jake led the way, occasionally turning back to check on Emily and Scout. When they reached a clearing that overlooked a valley, they stopped to rest. Emily took out the water bowl and poured a generous amount for Scout, who lapped it up eagerly. "Look at that view," Jake said, gesturing toward the rolling hills below. The valley stretched out before them, a patchwork of green and gold dotted with clusters of trees. A stream wound its way through the landscape, glinting in the sunlight. Emily nodded, catching her breath. "It's stunning. And Scout's doing so well." She reached down to scratch behind his ears. "You're amazing, buddy. Absolutely amazing." Scout responded with a wag of his tail and a quick lick to her hand. Jake smiled, pulling out his phone to capture the scene. Emily knelt beside Scout, wrapping her arms around him as Jake snapped a photo. "This is one for the album," he said, grinning. After their break, they continued on. The trail leveled out briefly before dipping down into a shady grove. The temperature dropped slightly, and the sound of running water grew louder. Emily felt a thrill of anticipation as she realized they must be nearing the lake. Scout seemed to sense it too. His pace quickened, and he let out a few happy barks. When they finally emerged from the trees, the lake stretched out before them, its surface shimmering like a sheet of glass. The water was surrounded by a sandy shore that gave way to lush grass, and the forest framed the scene perfectly. A few ducks floated lazily near the far side, and the air was filled with the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Scout ran ahead, his paws kicking up sand as he reached the water's edge. He stopped just short of the lake, sniffing the air, then stepped in cautiously. The moment his paws hit the water, his tail started wagging furiously. He waded deeper, splashing and turning in circles, clearly in his element. Emily and Jake laughed, watching him enjoy himself. They found a spot under a large tree and spread out a blanket. Emily unpacked their snacks and handed Jake a sandwich, while Scout continued to play in the shallows. The sight of him so happy and carefree filled Emily's heart. "This is perfect," she said, leaning against Jake. "It's exactly what he needed." Jake nodded, taking a bite of his sandwich. "And exactly what we needed, too." After lunch, they took turns throwing sticks for Scout, who happily retrieved them from the water. His energy seemed endless, his movements smooth and confident. Emily snapped more pictures, unable to resist capturing each joyful moment. When he finally tired, Scout returned to the blanket, flopping down beside Emily with a contented sigh. They stayed by the lake for hours, letting Scout rest before exploring the shoreline further. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter, quiet conversation, and the soothing sound of water. By the time they packed up and started the hike back, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail. The return trip was calm and peaceful. Scout walked steadily, his earlier exuberance mellowed into a gentle trot. Emily and Jake fell into a comfortable rhythm, their footsteps soft against the forest floor. The temperature had warmed, and the golden light of late afternoon painted the landscape in warm hues. When they reached the car, Scout hopped in and immediately curled up on the back seat. Emily turned to Jake as he loaded their gear into the trunk. "That was amazing," she said softly. "I'll never forget it." Jake smiled. "Neither will I, and I think Scout had the best day ever." On the drive home, Emily glanced back at Scout. He was fast asleep, his tail curled around his body. She felt a swell of gratitude, not just for the day they'd had, but for every step that had brought them to this point. Scout's journey was one of resilience, love, and unwavering joy. Each adventure, no matter how small, was a testament to how far he had come. Over the next several weeks, they returned to the lake trail a few more times. Each visit felt like a gift, a chance to see Scout's happiness on full display. His condition, once a source of anxiety, had become something they hardly thought about. Scout was healthy, strong, and thriving, and every moment with him was precious. As winter approached, Emily and Jake started planning new trips. They talked about visiting a snowy mountain pass or a quiet forest trail that turned magical under a blanket of snow. Scout's love for adventure showed no signs of fading, and they were eager to keep exploring. The journey wasn't just about the trails or the views. It was about the time they spent together, the bond they shared, and the memories they created. Through it all, Scout remained the heart of their family. His golden coat shone brightly in every photograph, and his tail wagged in every memory. The path ahead was long, and that was exactly how they wanted it to be. Each step brought them closer. Each adventure reminded them of what truly mattered, and every moment was a gift they would treasure forever. As autumn deepened into winter, the routine that Emily, Jake, and Scout had built felt more meaningful than ever. The crisp mornings, the sound of Scout's paws on frosted grass, and the way his breath puffed out in little clouds all added a special kind of magic to their daily walks. The changing seasons had always been beautiful, but seeing them through Scout's eyes made them feel more alive, more vibrant. He approached every outing, every new trail, with the same infectious enthusiasm he'd shown from the very beginning. One particular morning, Emily woke up to a soft snowfall that blanketed their neighborhood in white. She pulled back the curtain, smiling as she watched the flakes drift down. Scout was already at the window, his tail wagging furiously. He loved the snow. The first time he'd experienced it, he'd bounded into the yard like a puppy, kicking up powder and snapping at the falling flakes as if trying to catch them in his mouth. Today was no different. Emily called for Jake, who came into the room still rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Snow day?" he asked with a grin, glancing at Scout. "Snow day," she confirmed. They dressed warmly, layered in thick coats, scarves, and gloves. Scout practically danced by the door as they clipped on his leash, his excitement impossible to contain. They decided to visit a nearby park known for its winter trails. The drive was short, the roads still clear enough to navigate safely. When they arrived, the park was quiet, the usual bustle of hikers replaced by a serene stillness. The snow muffled everything, turning the world into a peaceful, sparkling wonderland. Scout bolted forward the moment they stepped out of the car, his paws sinking into the fresh powder. Emily laughed, watching him bound ahead and then turn back, as if urging them to hurry up. The trail they chose wound through a grove of evergreens, their branches heavy with snow. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the faint rustle of the wind. Scout zigzagged along the path, his nose buried in the snow one moment, his ears perked up at a distant sound the next. His joy was contagious, and Emily found herself grinning from ear to ear. As they walked, Jake pulled out his phone to take pictures. "Look at this," he said, showing Emily a shot of Scout leaping through the snow, his coat a brilliant contrast against the white backdrop. "He's having the time of his life," Emily said, her breath visible in the cold air. She reached down to ruffle Scout's fur. "You love this, don't you, buddy?" Scout responded with a bark and a playful bounce, spraying snow everywhere. Jake laughed, snapping another picture. "He's like a snow angel in motion." They continued deeper into the park, the trail leading them to a frozen pond surrounded by trees. The surface gleamed in the pale sunlight, and the area was so still it felt as though time had paused. They decided to rest for a moment, finding a bench that had been cleared by a previous visitor. Emily brushed off a spot, and they sat down. Scout trotted over, his tail wagging as he plopped down at their feet. Emily pulled a thermos from her bag and poured hot tea for herself and Jake. She also took out a small container of dog treats, which Scout accepted with great enthusiasm. "This is perfect," Jake said, sipping his tea. "Just us, Scout, and the snow." Emily nodded. "It's moments like this that make everything worthwhile." Scout looked up at them, his eyes bright, as if agreeing. He stretched out in the snow, letting the cold seep through his fur. To Emily, he looked completely at peace, as though he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. After their break, they began the trek back. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was clearing, revealing a soft blue expanse. The late morning sunlight cast long shadows, making the trees appear taller and the trail more defined. Scout led the way, his tail wagging with each step. Emily and Jake walked in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the natural beauty around them. When they reached the car, Scout hopped into the back seat and immediately curled up. He had burned off plenty of energy, but he still looked as though he could go another round if they asked. Emily chuckled as she buckled her seatbelt. "You never run out of steam, do you?" she said, glancing back at him. Scout responded with a sleepy blink and a soft wag of his tail. The drive home was quiet, the warmth of the car contrasting with the crisp air they'd just left behind. Emily rested her head against the window, watching the snowy landscape blur past. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the day they'd had, but for all the days they'd spent with Scout. His presence had transformed their lives, turning simple walks into meaningful journeys and quiet mornings into cherished memories. As winter continued, their routine remained a constant source of joy. They explored more snowy trails, sometimes venturing further afield to find new paths. Each trip brought its own discoveries, from frozen waterfalls to fields blanketed in untouched snow. Scout thrived in the cold, his energy never waning. Emily and Jake often joked that he must have been part Arctic wolf, the way he bounded through drifts without a care in the world. One particularly memorable outing took them to a high plateau known for its panoramic views. The climb was steady but manageable, and the reward at the top was breathtaking. The snowy expanse stretched out before them, the distant hills dusted in white. They could see for miles, the horizon a mix of soft blue and shimmering white. Scout stood proudly at the edge, his ears pricked forward, his tail wagging as if he knew he'd conquered something special. Emily took a photo, framing Scout against the stunning backdrop. "This one's going on the wall," she said, smiling at Jake. He nodded. "Absolutely. He looks like he belongs here." They spent a long time at the top, taking in the view and letting Scout explore. When they finally began the descent, they did so slowly, savoring every moment. Emily felt a sense of peace that was hard to describe. These hikes, these moments in the snow, were more than just outings. They were a way of life, a way of finding balance and joy amid the hustle and bustle of daily responsibilities. Back home, they would gather by the fireplace, Scout stretched out on his favorite rug. Emily would sip tea and scroll through the day's photos, reliving the adventure. Each picture was a reminder of how far Scout had come and how much he had given them. His resilience, his joy, and his love had brought them closer together, turning their house into a home and their routine into a celebration of life's simple pleasures. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Emily and Jake began planning their next series of adventures. They talked about returning to favorite trails, exploring new ones, and maybe even venturing further afield to places they'd only dreamed of visiting. Scout would be by their side every step of the way, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight, his tail wagging with an uncontainable joy that reminded them to cherish every moment. Through it all, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Scout's journey had brought them so much more than they could have ever imagined. The future was a wide, open trail, and she was eager to see where it would lead. Scout's final days were filled with the same joy and love that had defined his life. By now, his walks were shorter and more deliberate, but his spirit never wavered. Every morning, he would wag his tail at the sight of his leash, eager to explore the neighborhood, even if it was just a gentle stroll down the familiar paths he had walked so many times before. Emily and Jake cherished these moments, knowing each step was a gift. They made a point to take him to his favorite spots, the park with the winding creek, the sunny field where he loved to chase butterflies, and the trail that led to the small pond where he'd always splash in the shallows. Each outing was a chance to celebrate Scout's remarkable journey, to remember all the adventures they had shared. One sunny afternoon, Emily and Jake took Scout to a quiet meadow just outside of town. It was the place where he had first run off leash as a pup, chasing after leaves and tumbling into the soft grass. As they spread out a blanket, Scout settled beside them, his head resting on Emily's lap. The warmth of the sun, the gentle breeze, and the comforting sounds of nature seemed to put him at ease. Jake leaned back and smiled, his hand resting gently on Scout's back. "He's had a good life," he said quietly. "He's given us so much." Emily nodded, her eyes misting as she stroked Scout's golden fur. "And we've given him a good life too. We've shared so many amazing memories." Scout sighed softly, his tail wagging once as if to agree. For Emily, it was a moment of pure gratitude. Gratitude for the love they had shared, for the bond that had grown stronger with each passing year. Scout had been more than a pet. He had been a best friend, a companion through life's ups and downs, and a constant source of joy. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they packed up their things and headed home. Scout walked slowly but steadily, his head held high. Emily and Jake stayed close, giving him time to enjoy every step. Back home, Scout curled up in his favorite spot by the fireplace, his eyes closing as he drifted off into a peaceful sleep. In the days that followed, Scout's strength began to fade, but his spirit remained as bright as ever. Emily and Jake stayed by his side, giving him all the love and comfort they could. On a quiet morning, surrounded by those who loved him most, Scout passed away peacefully, his tail wagging one final time. It was a loss deeply felt, but also a celebration of a life well lived. Scout had shown them what it meant to live with joy, courage, and unconditional love. His memory became a guiding light, inspiring them to embrace each moment, to cherish every day, and to find happiness in the simple, beautiful things in life. Scout's journey wasn't just his own, it was theirs too. And as they continued to walk the trails he had loved, Emily and Jake carried his spirit with them, forever grateful for the time they had shared with the dog who had changed their lives.